Hello. It is storming today. Now that the hurricane's edges have come here to central Alabama. But, it was a good sunshiny day. And we have had some students who were not able to join us. So, as usual, I'll be starting with a recap of what we did today in class. So today was where the rubber meets the road. It is week 3 and our fourth class session. Strangely, because of course we meet only one day in the first week of classes, and students were required by 11 o'clock this morning to have a top 3 of their games of choice. And what an interesting set of top threes it was, including 2 students each interested in Sleepaway and Stew Pot and Thousand-Year-Old Vampire, among many other choices. We had a strong interest also in various other kinds of journaling and keepsake games, which is very exciting. And so I planted the seed of a field guide to memory as a potential alternate for games like amending, which is one of the kind of stars of this semester. I actually almost bulk purchased this for the whole class because Shing is going to be joining Auburn in February. So one lucky student successfully got snagged the copy of Amending and is adopting it. Also adopted Thousand-Year-Old Vampire, good, Tim Hutchings game, and what I really love about this is this was adopted by a document design student, and Tim has very kindly offered to make his InDesign files available to students that are interested because the original InDesign files have a whole bunch of Easter eggs in the layers of, material that are included in the layout. So hopefully, I will be able to call in that favor. Another early, quick, snapped up game was Stephen Dewey's 10 Candles. Had a student basically imprint on it almost immediately. The student who ended up picking it has already read it in its entirety. This is my copy. Students have access to PDF copies of all of these games, and I will be bringing the physical copies of the games that I own or that I can get my hands on to class when we're engaging with the materials and kind of walking through them together in class. So, bare minimum, they have PDF access, but of course, many of these are beautiful objects. Another student selected the Deep Dark, which is a really lovely, if small, um, kind of, you know, variation on, dungeoneering. Um, as will not surprise many folks, we've got a good society in the house. The Jane Austen role playing game has been a fan favorite, even though I don't directly teach it. It's too long to include, but there's always students who gravitate towards the idea of playing with Austen. Um, yes, I too am manifesting a future student to pick the Apollo 47 technical manual. I don't have a physical copy of it, and it might kill me to add it to the stack that I bring in a giant creepy duffel bag. But they do have access to the Apollo 47 technical manual PDF in their library that I make available for them. So someday, it's an engineering school. Come on, it's got to happen, right? Also selected by a student, and not surprising, it's such a beautiful object, is Bluebeard's Bride. Um, this student is also very interested in Everyone is John, which I think is actually a really interesting pairing. And the student is considering contracting this class for honors credit, which requires extra work. Um, I have given them until the end of the week to think a little bit more and talk to the people that they want to play this with. They're playing with trusted group of friends because of the mature and intense content of this game. And I have some warnings for some games like this in the database. And then I'm very, very excited that a student immediately imprinted on this chunky boy, Coyote and Crow. and has already like I could barely take the book away from them at the end of class, which is really, really lovely. It's of course a gorgeous book. And we took some time to appreciate it and the way that it talks about what a role-playing game is. Because of course, what we did after everybody picked everything is we flipped through these books, not specifically the ones that people had picked, but the ones that they hadn't picked, which included a bunch of 1990s versions of World of Darkness games like Changeling and Vampire, as well as Steve Jackson's Tune, and some more modern games like Tim Hutchings' series of improving exercises, the game Sign, which I actually thought a student would pick. We've got a linguistics major in the house, and a couple of other various games. And I wanted, because what they're going to do for Friday, their assignment is to look at their game in their PDF form and find where it does or doesn't define what a role playing game is. And what we found was, of course, that this varies a great deal. And I've been inspired by the Yes Indeed podcast of this week's interview with Layla Edelman, where Layla said that she didn't actually think that every game needed a what is a role playing game section. And she's right. I'm inclined to agree with her that if a game assumes that you already are an experienced role player and kind of would necessitate an experienced role player to play, then what you're doing is instead clarifying what your game is rather than saying and explaining what a role playing game is more generally. Much depends on your intention with your intended audience. And so we actually found this. I told them you might not find an explanation for what a role playing game is, depending on the age of the game and who it's kind of made for. Changeling the Dreaming doesn't get around to any discussion of the rules for over 100 pages. Instead, it's all vibes and scene setting, which makes sense if you think about it as part of the interconnected world of darkness, and that people are probably familiar with that from prior White Wolf games. Tim Hutchings, once again, was that kind of classic example of you just kind of dive in this kind of way. And we took a look. I had projected the discussion Avery Alder has in Dream Askew, Do a Dream Apart, for the play to find out no dice, no masters, which I kind of showed them this is how I would talk about. This is not saying what a role playing game is, but it's saying what this role playing game is in kind of distinction to other role playing games. So it's building a kind of more expansive understanding. And then I gave them an example of a kind of generic what is a role playing game that was written in 2021 to bounce off of if they're kind of working from a sense of absence. Uh, yes, World of Darkness got a lot of love and attention. And indeed, Jason. Jason Carl, just telling this little stream, got I think so perturbed by the fact that I was bringing my OG vampire copy in all its messiness to the students that they are kindly kind of sending the PDFs and a V5 copy of Vampire. I swear there's a copy of the V5 Quick Start Guide in the library. I would not necessarily have them playing the original Vampire, but it is useful as a kind of artifact. And that's what we did, was talking about like how these games also change over time, at both, and also transform through play. Um, yeah, yes, Luke. Yeah, no, it's always lovely when you can go into that library, and I use as a kind of service that's free for my use called Perusal to put these PDFs in a place where not only can they access them in ways that I can kind of keep track of, but and are kind of not on the open web, but also they can annotate them, and if they mark something with a question mark or tag me specifically, they can basically, it pings me an alert that says, oh, a student has a question about this game and maybe I can help. And they can also use hashtags to tag different parts of content if they're doing research. They can annotate them in all kinds of ways that are really, I think, useful. So sometimes we're annotating together and sometimes we're annotating separately. So a field guide to memory has indeed been adopted just to kind of go through the last of the games that have been selected by students because we do have one student who is absent who luckily their top three are complete outliers from everyone else. Kingdom, The Wretched, and Hearthlight are the top three that they're deciding between. So when they're feeling better, then it'll be great. um, the student who chose Coyote and Crow was also looking at Firebrand and Gubat Banwa. Um, we had a student select Paranoia, which means I need to go get a physical copy of Paranoia if I can. They also had Wickedness on the list, which makes sense because it's a beautiful little game. And my students have really kind of taken to belonging outside belonging games, which is really, really lovely. Um, Kids on Bikes got a look-see, but no adoption this time. Alien RPG, same, same, same. So, also Call of Cthulhu had some interest, and students do wanna talk about Cthulhu, and we will be talking about Cthulhu, when we talk about mystery and detective mechanics. Lighthouse at the Edge of the Universe, which is a kind of journaling game of some duration, as well as the letter writing journaling game Quill also got some attention, which is very, very cool. So there were some students who are really kind of struggling between options. And so because I'm comfortable with the fact that we have a representative spread or a pretty close to representative spread, and because the students are who are kind of deciding are still deciding between a kind of narrow band of options that I'm comfortable with them potentially choosing between. I said, Friday is the key. And Friday is the key because that's when they're going to be submitting the first draft of their class contract. So, students in this class have a set of tasks that they can choose from in order to build out an educational experience. So, there's stuff that we're going to all be doing together, including asking these questions of these different role playing games. And we're going to ask a series of those kinds of questions, including how is it defining or is it defining what a role playing game is? How does the game's mechanics contribute to meaning? What is the central metaphor? How did the play experience go? Who are the people of the genealogy of the game? Who not only who made it, but what games inspired it or spun off from it? Um, Awards and actual plays. In addition to that kind of core experience that everyone's gonna share, they're also building towards what Ryan Cordell calls an unessay. So a writing task that isn't necessarily taking a traditional essay form, but is communicating or creating something that takes what they've learned and applies it. And so on the path to that, they can choose to do a series of tasks, and the number of tasks they pick will depend on what grade they want to get. In other words, how much time they want to spend outside of class. So they can choose from different tasks that take roughly 2 to 4 hours. In very specific cases, they can choose to read and do a kind of annotated précis of an academic article. Most students won't do that in this class. They won't need to. Instead, gameplay reports, if they're playing in someone else's game in class or they choose to play an additional game, like the student who fell in love with Field Guide to Memory but is also doing Blades in the Dark, they can get credit for that, as well as helping me with research in terms of actual play. So, watching episodes of actual play and filling out qualitative analyses that help expand our understanding of the world of actual play. I am at work on a collectively authored book on specifically Dimension 20 in the first 5 years of Dimension 20, and Dimension 20 imagined as a gateway into kind of including actual play in the classroom. And so I have also, this is being announced here first. It will be announced elsewhere on social media in the coming days. But I have, in solidarity with Dropout, donated basically free access, 3-month subscriptions to Dropout for all of my students enrolled in the class who are not already Dropout subscribers. And that's because I think that I'm realizing more and more that Dropout, and Dimension 20 serve as a very good entry point for people who are totally new to the form of actual play. There's a lot of wonderful actual play out there, but the last 2 years have really taught me that there's a certain amount of friction. And so podcasts are really good ways to eliminate that friction. And on the visual side, this may we're going to see if this helps as a potential kind of space of lowering friction. I am also giving students access to the nominees for the New Jersey Web Fest, partly because Ned Donovan will be visiting us, partly because I am actively still serving as a judge. And so they will also have the opportunity to see a much wider palette of actual play performances if they so choose. Um, and in addition, they can also devise research tasks or work with me on research tasks that I know we need to do. For example, we're looking to collect and annotate actual play transcripts. And that is probably a project that's going to spin up for the next undergraduate research fellow or fellows who work with me into the next year. So piloting that task and seeing what can we annotate and how can we annotate it is also something that's on the table for students to potentially think about. But so by Friday, they kind of have a initial kind of, this is what I think I'm going to do. These are the deadlines I think I'm going to use for that. This is where my interests are. They've already been asked by me to think about their intellectual investments in the class. And so it's a really kind of lovely point in the semester to start thinking about this. Do I need actual play transcripts? Yes, I do. Oh my god. I before class was meeting with my one of my former undergraduates who now works for Auburn in the library as our digital scholarship librarian, Carrie Hill, and she's a big data woman, which is really lovely. She's done some amazing data work on, for example, archive of our own tags, among other things. And so she's looking for big data sets that she can turn into research projects. And I have questions that I think sometimes the transcripts might be able to answer. So, what I'm tentatively piloting is going around and asking folks, hey, does your show have transcripts for accessibility that you keep in a Google Drive? We'd love to have them to see if we can figure out some interesting questions to ask. Weirdly, this is exactly the same kind of machine learning that everyone hates right now because of the looming specter of AI, but what we're doing is human-sized. There will be a person who is looking at the transcripts and hand encoding different features that we're looking for. And then we'll kind of do some algorithmic stuff to see if we can then write a script that, can see like how often do male identified people speak, or, how many times is a dice roll happening in different kinds of games or what have you. Um, yes, there is some really interesting micro work that has been done, Luke, in um, kind of you know, exactly this kind of coding of elements of a particular episode of something. And so we're kind of tentatively, like literally this conversation started today, thinking about, what kinds of things could we do just kind of brute force with a transcript versus what could we code for very quickly and comparatively easily with some help from undergrads or that kind of thing. Um, and yeah, so we if the transcripts are clean, ideally, if they have the speaker identified, which many of the transcripts that we've come across so far, like Critical Roles transcripts or Dimension 20s or Worlds Beyond Number, or that sort of thing, do have those things. So we don't need real fancy, but ideally clean with speakers marked is the most useful for us, and eliminates a lot of the cleanup. So yeah, so that's something that students can potentially get involved in if that's where their kind of interest lies. And the kind of student who I've identified as basically my current undergraduate research fellow basically told one of the students who's currently enrolled, you need to be in this class and you need to be an undergraduate research fellow, which is a compensated position. Students are paid for summer work and into the school year to do research to learn how the sausage is made. And I've had students working on different questions of actual play. You will recall, if you follow me on Twitter, that Olivia Price has been working on backstage labor, doing interviews with production side folks in both studio and remote play. And now I have a student who's working on other kinds of issues of representation and labor now that we are in the middle, of course, of a time of strikes. This is a form that really arose between the strikes, and now the WGA and SAG strikes are transforming the media landscape once again, which is really cool. Um, so yeah, so we're also looking into like possibilities for seeing if there's like scraping methods that we can use. Again, this is one of those real challenges of the moment that we're in. The stuff that was kind of benign or perceived as benign now has certain kinds of valences. We are trying to build a corpora not to replace actual plays with AI or anything like that. We're trying to form interpretive questions. We're not generating anything out of it other than potentially answers to our questions. And yet, it's often some of the same techniques. So it gets real messy and people might get nervous. So I expect to maybe be doing a lot of hearts and minds kind of labor in that respect. But yeah, so fun. This is the nature of research at this moment in time. But yeah, so the fact that accessibility has become such a important thing in the TTRPG field, community, industry, whatever you want to call it, means that it's more likely that we'll be able to get transcripts and not just from kind of the big guys, but that ambitious middle of which many by night shows fall into, right? In fact, one of the things I'm really potentially interested in is seeing if we can slice and dice data to do comparative studies of what D&D shows, like rhythms, patterns, word choices, frequency of interaction with dice, whatever, compared to something like a corpora based on World of Darkness games or even specifically Vampire versus PBTA hacks, right? Like that's a really interesting question. And we think we have some idea about what answers we would come up with, but you know, we can't nobody can watch all these things, in that kind of both granular and broad way at once. Um, no, I think that's a really interesting question actually, whether there is more swearing, like who swears more, right? Like comedy, serious, is it system specific? Is it audio based like podcast first versus video? I mean, that's a really interest like, actually, that alone, we could code really, really easily, right? Get the 7, George Carlin's, words you can't say and do a brute kind of that's a very easy thing to code for, because it's just a kind of, control F sort of experience. And then we could indeed see, like, is there a frequency? Is there a pattern? Is there a particular curse word that's more likely to be used? Does everybody love the good old English word, fuck as much as I think they do? But yeah, John brings up a really good point, which is that what would have to control for if you were kind of going by system is if you are dealing with systems where the lore has their own kind of slang for cursing that's very likely to be used if players are fully immersed. And that's actually that's kind of true of World of Darkness, although I think in terms of expletives rather than insults are lore specific, but expletives, I don't think as much. Wow, what an interesting question. And indeed, this is the kind of thing that could become an unessay, could become a set of research tasks for a student if they really fell down that rabbit hole, which is really, really cool. So I'm uh, kind of it's gonna be very interesting if one so we have a student who has to make a complete decision. We also have a student who's trying to decide between some really interesting broad sweep. They're at once very interested in stuff like Fellowship and the One Ring. And I warned them that you have to be a little bit of a personal opinion, glutton for punishment with the One Ring in comparison to other kind of high fantasy descended from Tolkien sort of spaces because of I find the One Ring more resource management heavy. It's low magic or lower magic. It is not my personal cup of tea, although for the people who love it, it is exactly their jam. And I have friends who fall into that category. And it seems like this student and his friends, this may exactly be their jam. Although they've also kind of taken a look at some other games that are also on their agenda. So something crunchy that way comes, I think, which is a useful data point to have in a kind of collection of games that tend to um, beautiful experiences, individual experiences, silly experiences. I'm very glad that paranoia is part of it. Uh, but yeah, so we don't have that hardcore crunchy goodness, but that student will be bringing it in. Um, Indeed, may God have mercy on their souls because but that's the interesting thing, right? Is like many of these students are total newbies, so it's not surprising that they're going to pick some of the more accessible modern games. It's not surprising that some students do not want to have another group work thing fail, and so are not gonna have their grade like depend on being able to schedule stuff. The other thing that have to have in their contract is when they're going to play and that got people they've committed to when they're going to play one, two, or three times in the semester, depending on the grade that they want. Yeah, paranoia is super underrated. I'm very curious to see how they play it, whether they choose to play it in a kind of campaign mode or whether they choose to inflict it on three different groups of their friends. Deeply, deeply curious. Um, Bonus marks for being able to schedule the games. No, I mean literally, like the here's what you're expected to do this week really was a reminder that the experienced people in this room, myself included, are going to tell the newbies that the hardest thing about a tabletop role playing game is not learning the rules, or even picking the good snacks. It's making sure that everybody is in one place at one time to play a game. So scheduling is an important part of this. The kind of fail safe is that they can recruit their friends and family if they so choose, totally legit. But other students in the class can receive contract credit for playing in other people's games. So there's a kind of now we're mutually invested in this game coming off. And because there are some games that the multiple students were interested in playing, I think that also helps. So we've got some kind of common cause groups kind of working together here. It's a big experiment, don't get me wrong. The first time I taught this class, I let students as an unessay run a game and just a one shot. So I there was a one shot of Good Society that was like a full on like tea party whole situation. Another student wrote their own like murder mystery kind of tabletop game complete with all of like these characters and the images. I mean, you know, this was an immersive LARP experience that was ultimately crafted. The second time, I actually gave students who wanted to run a game space within the final weeks of class to run that game. And what was interesting is only one student wanted to do that, but the other students also wanted to play something. So I ended up having to DM, and it was a great pleasure. We played Brindlewood Bay while the other uh, table was running a custom D&D campaign that the student had designed as their own essay. So I regret nothing, but this is an experiment to see what happens when everyone needs to play at least once outside of class. Um, yes, we should absolutely acknowledge that. And one of the things that was really impressed upon me, especially from I had students write some, kind of "Where do you know from?" which is an exercise, that comes to me through Eugenia Zorowski. I'm gonna talk about this at Big Bad Con as well, but has students think about their intellectual investments and how they know not just academic-y stuff, but stuff through their communities, stuff through the land, stuff through their friend groups, stuff from their, passions of all kinds. And one of the and they're a beautiful kind of array of really amazing investments. The South is not a monolith. And as I said on Twitter today and on Blue Sky, it is a fallacy to think that the South is a monolith that cannot be redeemed. The kids, as they say, are all right, although my students are not kids, they are full adults. But they are tired. We are all tired, right? And the logics of, capitalism, yeah, weigh heavily. And the logics of kind of my students don't have enrollment caps. They don't have a limit on the number of classes they can take per semester. They pay an equal amount of tuition if they're doing a full load, no matter how big that load ends up being. And in some ways, that's in theory a really great idea about saving the cost. But what it means in practice is that it's often an overload that is punishingly difficult, especially on top of students' realities that they work off campus or they do other, things. They have full lives, they have families, they have other responsibilities. So yeah, the time management thing, making them make time to play both in and out of class is one of the liberatory practices of this class. Because if they can say, "My professor is making me do it," even though it's a leisure activity, the dial goes like it at least gives them the space for play. And while they do have to write a play report, they don't need to intellectualize the entire experience. They need to reflect on the experience. But honestly, at this point, we all need joy and we all need pleasure. And we all need a little bit of a moment to just, you know, explore something that doesn't have a use. And so if I can give them a kind of pseudo use excuse, use excuse, let's go with that. Uh, to play, it's a beautiful thing. And really this is a class that started immediately after we returned from a semester of remote teaching, right? This started in the fall of 2021. It is always already in the shadow of a time of increased stress and loss and all kinds of things. And that's a lot. And I think that's one of the reasons why students turn and no, I know that's one of the reasons why students turn to this class. And it is my privilege to allow them to think deeply while playing deeply. In different kinds of ways. So I bring the thinky games into the space of class. Um, And then if they want to, play little fluffy ball games, great. Um, or if they want to scare the hell out of themselves. So on Thursday of this week, we won't be doing office hours uh, because Josh Simons is coming. And that'll also be true the next week when Ned Donovan comes on Thursday. Basically, you gotta feed people. So no time to come home and record. Um, but it is a really lovely unstructured time, and it's going to be very interesting to see what kinds of questions they have for folks who are in different parts of the TTRPG field. Uh, I know Josh from his work at Demiplane and his work as a community manager before that, and his work kind of as an actual player on Children of Erte. But he's also kind of, not that far ahead of my students in terms of age. And so can talk about the kind of ways that you maneuver as a fairly young person who might have an interest. And I think, his advice is going to be very specific to tabletop, but I think it has broader applications for how do you navigate as a creative and interesting person, uh, you know, as you're kind of building from one job to the next job to the next job. Um, and so they have been told to, by whatever legal means necessary, come bright eyed, bushy tailed, and ready to ask questions. And then next week, we will do our next kind of interrogation of their chosen texts. And we're going to do that by way of taking a look at two different systems: Candela Obscura's 17-page quick start and the first 29 pages of Brindlewood Bay. We will also have in the room Call of Cthulhu. And of course, we have a student who's working on Blades in the Dark. So that will also be part of the conversational mix. And I'm calling this day Mechanics and Meaning because the idea is that what we're going to do is take a look at a very specific kind of mechanic here, how detectives or kind of investigators move through a space, and think about the different mechanics that each of those games has. And this kind of emerged from when Evan and Adrian and I were putting together the play list, so to speak, for our time together at the University of Bonn this summer, where we played for roughly 2 hours and then basically had the equivalent of a graduate seminar right after, to kind of talk through. And then it became unwittingly, I think at the beginning, and then more intentionally by the time we finalized everything, a kind of symposium on mystery mechanics and the different forms of investigation kind of shape a world. Indeed, how do you know in this game? Yes, Cthulhu is in all rooms. It is true. Um, and so I've said this before, but Candela, what's really interesting is that it is very much kind of propulsive in a way where you will find the kind of clue that propels you to a very specific next location, where you will find the next one and the next one in a very nice 5-act structure. And if you're more interested in character work, it's a very satisfying system. It also allows for, on the player's end, the sense of a kind of rich world, but without the real frustrations that come from investigations that are too open world. As someone who is running Regency Cthulhu and watching it take on a very glacial pace, I have a new appreciation for hopping and booming. Yeah, I mean, I highly, highly recommend this week's Yes Indeed podcast conversation with Layla Edelman, not because they talk specifically about Candela or Illuminated Worlds, but Edelman's ideas about about structure made the both the system and the game make more sense to me. And I think I think also watching Spencer run Candela this week is going to make things a little bit more emergent to me. Everyone is under NDA, so it's like the one game that's really hard to have a conversation with the creators about, which is, a really odd thing in a space where everyone else like really wants to talk about their stuff. But of course, Candela's not really out. It's a quick start. So it's just hampered by different kinds of challenges. But I think that to talk about larger principles and, lessons learned from other games, I think it's a game that, uh, is definitely pulling on lots of different parts of kind of mechanics that have worked, um, and thinking about it. Yes, I mean, I'm always excited about anything that says that, the bakers are working on. Um, and although I will not say on stream, I have Sandman is fraught for me, but that's a personal thing, not a inherent question of, the system. But yeah, so if Candela is kind of links on a chain that get you down the road, I mean, we can also call it railroading, but I don't like to think about that. I like to think about it more like a kind of a safety line. It's also invisible to the players. In I think it's not obvious. Chain roading. Um, I don't know. I think so here's what I think. Actually, here's the image that I like the most, I think, now that I think about it with Candela. It's like the chain that hauls you up the roller coaster before gravity sets in. So at a certain point at the climax of Candela, it's hurtling under its own propulsive force of the choices that the characters have made and all those sorts of things. And so the conclusion is less clear about what will happen. Although it is hurtling forward with a great deal of energy. But to get to that point, you are on the kind of climb up, on a chain, right? Um, and so, maybe that's what I like that's best. But what's interesting is I love Brindlewood Bay. I mean, I like both of these systems. I enjoy playing both of these systems. Um, but so we have Brindlewood Bay because it's quite literally the opposite. The game master has comparatively little, uh, not to do, but to control. I've gotten in some interesting debates with folks about Brindlewood Bay in terms of how much player agency there is. Um, and because I'm inclined to think of it as this is a game where ultimately the players decide the ending. And every time I've ever seen it played or played it myself, the players have done the math to figure out how many clues they need to include in the final calculation, in order to render the die roll to see if you're successful or not completely irrelevant. You don't have to play it that way. You can speculate throughout your time and roll to see if you're right, with fewer clues. I just have never seen it played that way. And so as someone I was talking to kind of said in an observation, it almost if you play the way that everyone I know, including myself, have played Brindlewood Bay, basically you get to be the red string board conspiracy theorist who's always right. And what does that say about agency and the world and the knowable world? Like I ran this game this summer and I was looking down at the sheet of like the things we know about the characters. And because of the nature of the final explanation, those things were not true. And so then the question became okay, am I, as the GM, going to assert that I have proposed, a world of reality? Or, that their speculation cannot overcome? Or am I going to perform going to make decisions that are based on the idea that, no, we honor the dice roll, we honor the speculation, we honor the story that the players had told and the dice have basically reaffirmed. And I chose the latter. And I think that's um, really interesting. Yeah, Luke, I think invisible to who is an interesting question when it comes to Candela and to Brindlewood. You know, if you are part of the Alder play to find out style, um, you know, it may not be your game. Because if you start to feel like there's only one way forward, and I guess the question, I mean, I guess it becomes one of those questions of how the game is run, which is why I'm glad that we have Candela as an actual play. Although I think it's an interesting choice to have Mercer run it, who has nothing to do with the design, and then Spencer, who very much does. It will be very interesting to see if they ever have Taliesin Jaffe run that game. Certainly don't know. But it would be very interesting since, in many ways, the vibe is his brainchild, even if the mechanics are indebted to Spencer and Rowan and Layla and, and on and on and on and on and on. So I think it's also a question of, how successful a GM can be in hiding the chain. And indeed, what players are interested in terms of this question of, are you trying to find an emergent narrative, kind of broader, about the world? Like, at what level are you trying to be transformative? And I think the what CR is proposing, what Darrington Press seems to be proposing, I mean, this is totally me speculating. Um, I have no inside knowledge. Um, yeah, no, I think, yeah, the CBR interview was interesting with Spencer, and it'll be interesting to see um how it plays, like, literally, like, what we end up seeing on Thursday, in a kind of side by side comparison. Um, in because Matt is indeed such a kind of world builder, and he also kind of changed the first iteration of the game, um or the first episode of the first chapter, really interestingly, um does something the game doesn't, which is, the hook is third person cinematic and no player has anything to do with any of it. And instead, Matt makes this part of the origin story of Ashley Johnson's character with her consent, and she knows this is what's going to happen, as we see from session zero. This is such a fascinating kind of situation with the actual play, and the way that Candela very much is like Candela as a show has to kind of do some jiggery pokery with narrative time and show the session zero at the end to satisfy the ways in which it's a mystery, although it is not a mystery necessarily to the players, or it's only a partial mystery, because things have been agreed upon in session zero that become emergent, or kind of revealed, sometimes emergent, sometimes revealed in gameplay. So yeah, uh, it's an interesting. I mean, considering how Critical Role is such about emergent character, we see it being built layer by layer, choice by choice, and then Candela is very much the kind of heavy kind of setting up stuff, out of the viewer's eye, in the way that, other short forms like Dimension 20, like other shorter pieces, end up doing. Um, and it's gonna be very interesting to see what happens in Spencer's hand, precisely to see if he runs it more in that kind of PBTA way, or something completely different. But yeah, Matt's running definitely showed um I don't know, 'cause I still am trying to figure out how to describe what that was. I haven't written about it precisely because, um, aside from, like, the kind of first look and contextualizing it with the, um with the quick start, because I had a screener, then got the quick start, and kind of was writing, and then it came out live, and then had almost filed my copy with Polygon. I had some interview stuff from before I had any content. I just got to throw questions into the email ether, um, and, and on and on and on. Um, but I'm mulling over what I wanna think, and I'm kinda taking this opportunity to talk to my students, about this, especially since I have a student who's very interested in CR and Candela, to kind of see how it plays with other people in the same way that I screened Candela with a group of people this summer to see how it played to an audience that was completely unfamiliar, that was not having a parasocial experience, that knew what actual play was, that certainly knew what role playing games were, but that had no preconceived notions of any of this. Um, so I kind of am constantly trying to model for my students and everybody else the ways in which it can't just be my taste and my vibes when I'm doing scholarly analysis. It has to d- kind of be beyond that in some way, shape, or form. Yeah, the Candela Session 0, it's gonna be interesting to compare the 2 chapters. It's also gonna be interesting. What's interesting, right, is that famously, Dimension 20 does not tape its session zeros at all. As far as I know, I don't have information about whether Critical Role, tapes, like, even for internal purposes, any of the kind of experimenting that they do prior to the start of a campaign. I just don't know. All we know, and this is public knowledge, is that there are kind of shakedown crews, initial play tests of 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 characters to see if they work, if they literally mechanically work. And there's some kind of vibe stuff when there's new casts being assembled as they would be for Candela. So this session 0 is probably actually a session point 5, in that respect, as we might understand it. But yeah, there was clearly some conversations that had already happened. There were still some conversations that would happen later. There was still some decision making, but a lot of decision making that was happening. Um, you know, it's really, really hard, if not impossible, to faithfully represent a session 0 in all of its messy complexity in actual play. Precisely because if you're doing it right, you're also talking about safety tools and things like that that may or may not, you know, be something people are comfortable with doing on camera, and that's totally fair. So yeah, and these are things that we're going to talk about, I think, or get started talking about next week, as we kind of take a look at these 2 rule sets and basically practice on them with thinking about kind of questions of mechanics. So so basically the students are going to be asked, by the end of that next week, to consider, is there a facilitator to this game? What do they do? Do players create characters? What are the skills and attributes those characters have? What elements or chance are present? When do you use them? What can a player do on their turn? Is there failure? What happens when failure occurs? Like consequence mechanics. What does a player need to keep track of in terms of resources? And what is the effect of all of those elements, in interesting kinds of ways? Um, so yeah, so that's gonna be the kind of next wave of interrogating their games in these kinds of ways. And hopefully that's also gonna be kind of more thinking. We've thought about this before, but more thinking about safety tools as they get ready to run their games. Because we will play in class in the subsequent weeks. And thus they will have lots of time outside of class, where they don't have to prep anything so they can be playing or getting ready to play their games. Um, yeah, I mean, I think friends at the table, if anybody could do it, it would be friends at the table, right? And yeah, and that they even have those kinds of um, you know, boundaries, I think is really important, is really telling, right? Because so much of their particular style is to show the kind of how it's made. I think so much of Friends at the Table as the kind of actual players, actual play, in terms of being a really useful resource in that way. In much the same way, I think in that kind of anthology shows, like One Shot or Party of One also kind of serve as these kind of quick introductions to many systems that Friends at the Table kind of luxuriates in those kinds of processes in really interesting ways. Um, but yeah, I think the more common method is what something like Vancouver by Night does, right? Like um it's we hit record after the session zero, after the kind of discussion of lines and veils, or in this case yellow and red cards. Yes, I love the artisan butcher's shop of AP. I don't know, that seems bloody. Although maybe Austin would appreciate that. I simply do not know. It's definitely um yeah, it's artisanal, I think is an interesting word, and maybe now people are just gonna start talking about that. Can maybe we can just stop talking about indie, a word that means nothing in this space, and I'm going to die on that hill. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that, um in the same way that if you come to Critical Role for plot, you'll hang yourself, it's the sentiment and the characters, and the plot is serving that. And I think that's also true of Candela, because that's a spiritual DNA of the style. If you come to Friends at the Table looking purely for razzmatazz, you're going to miss out on the pleasures of that for sure. And what they're doing and the kind of craft, that's present there. Which is to say there's no bad way to do actual play. Um, there's just, who's your audience and what are you trying to do? Um, plating is important. Yeah, and I will also die on the hill of production matters, and we should acknowledge that labor more effectively. Please and thank you. So yeah, so that's what's coming up. And of course, on top of all of this, we are hurtling towards Big Bad Con. And John has an email in my inbox, live, and probably have a heart attack of terror while I do so. There are 9 seats left for our session at Big Bad Con, which will hopefully be a little bit less rambly than me talking, in a live vlog format. And there'll be a few more beautiful Canva slides in the slide deck. No, we're not the 3rd most full. That's stupid. That's not okay. People should be there's much better stuff that should be that people can be watching. I don't know what to do with that information. That's not okay. People should be signing up for somebody. Well, no, no, that's not true. That can't be true. Well, I guess maybe it can be true. I don't know. I don't know. This will be my first specifically tabletop con. It's very likely to be the only one, except for maybe Metatopia. Um, my schedule just doesn't allow for a whole lot. There's a passel of people who are trying to convince me that Gen Con is a good idea, and I don't know that that is conducive to reality. Gen Con's literally the week or so before classes here. Also, it's huge and people are scary. Also, I'm not in the trade. I'm an observer, and that's a lot of things to observe. So there you go. Uh, I we what we are preparing for, the other thing that we're preparing for as these guests, as some of our later guests come, is we will be working on some other video content, some dare I say, highly produced video content, will be coming probably as a pilot to this channel, and then probably will have its own channel. We have not yet decided. We also don't have a name, but a group of us have been working on a project to make bite sized content for the analysis and study of tabletop and actual play so that people can use them. In classes that aren't just all TTRPG all the time. So, things like explainers like Intro to Bleed, introduction to different kinds of styles of games, what a tabletop role playing game is. And so we're going to be doing some interesting dialogic, unscripted uh, recording later this fall with the idea of cutting down to 5 to 10 minute explainer videos with animation. Someone said virtual sets. I'm excited because I don't have to do any of the editing, so, I'm gonna call it good. Um, yes, the other, Luke, as you note, the other reason why you won't catch me, at least at the moment, at PAX Unplugged or, other PAXes or Gen Con is the fact that I'm still reasonably COVID cautious. I do travel, but I do generally travel in ways that make it, you know, COVID aware, we'll call it. I mask to teach, I mask to travel, I mask at large conventions, and I'm a wuss in terms of peer pressure. So I don't put myself in situations, generally speaking, where I won't, where I may kind of feel undue pressure to kind of remove my mask when it's not necessarily the safest. So yeah, this is the reality of the moment. It's very interesting for me as a scholar if I had been in this space studying this stuff as opposed to just like watching it or playing it um kind of prior to 2020. I would have probably gone to everything. I would probably have, like, spent a bananas amount of cash on a lot of travel, which is what I did for my previous project, and the reason why I do this is because many archives closed during the pandemic, and so I was unable to keep that project kind of moving at a clip, and suddenly I found myself doing this, which is very exciting. Um Oh god. No, the answer to what? Uh, I forgot the question, or I guess I asked a lot of questions, but, uh, but yeah, so Big Bad Con is, uh oh, what a TTRPG is. I sure don't, which is what I find really funny. The danger of these quick explainer videos is that everyone involved is very inclined to say it's hashtag complicated, so it's a mess. To nail us down to saying things in a definitive way is we're not built that way anymore. We've been warped by our work. Um so we'll see how this grand experiment goes, in so many ways. Um, and but yeah, so yeah, Big Bad Con is coming down the pike. It's the first one. It's the grand experiment. We are trying to find ways to bring scholars and practitioners together. Um, there's the possibility that during the American Society for 18th Century Studies, which will be meeting in Toronto in the spring, that we might be able to kind of get the folks nearby together to talk about 18th century games. Um, yes, no, the as Luke notes, the underlying reality of what is a TTRPG is that there is a lyric game or unreleased Jade Dragon project that definitely challenges any definition. I mean, basically, um, and definitions are really useful, but yeah, they're limiting. And this is the same thing with actual plays. Like, what are the boundaries of actual play? Welcome to my nightmare. I generally say it's performed play that involves a legible game experience. And then, of course, what is a TTRPG game and how is it different from an improv game? And what does it mean to be legible as a game experience? The extreme edge case, of course, is midst, which started out very embryonically as a kind of a tabletop improvish game, but quickly lost all of that. So it's an improvised story, but there's no, as far as I know, no longer any remaining kind of elements of chance. It's just yes ands all the way down, which I think is one extreme of the form, and then there's a kind of bunch of different kinds of extremes. But the important thing is, I'm not the sole arbiter of these things. I'm trying to be descriptive of what people actually use most of the time. Um, yes, defining reality, cannot recommend. It's really wiggly, and gets real challenging. Um, and yes, the fact that actual play has itself morphed as a term emerging from the forge is one of the challenges. On the one hand, it's the most commonly used term we have. And despite all attempts to the contrary to kind of make something else happen, it hasn't. And now we have academics who are using it. Live play no longer works in a medium where almost nothing is live. I find it really fascinating. There's at least one some there's at least one show that's defining itself as a live play that is very clearly and very has been very transparent in the fact that it is pre-recorded. So I don't know what to do with that. No, we can't make live play art. Um, no, I mean, and one of the things that I'm trying to do is basically like with my book on actual play is indeed kind of say like there's a thread of actual play that indeed comes forward out of the forge and out of those kinds of play reports and things like that. And it co but it comes together and it like a little stream, it comes and then feeds into other little streams, like it's we're talking about a delta here, right? Um, other little streams that are coming down from improv circles, from immersive theater experiences, from LARP, and elsewhere, um, to kind of create a new river that and then forks off in other kinds of ways. Um, and what's really interesting, right, is that then once it gets going, and people wanna kind of tap in, and this is where the image of the river doesn't exactly work anymore. You see, people coming from audio drama who are interested in it as a possibility in one kind of way, people coming from Twitch streaming, uh, and interested in a different kind of way, people coming YouTubers and writers and designers, and everybody's coming and bringing a different set of aesthetic kind of interests and preoccupations, and values, right? They're coming from different fields to do this work and create this stuff, which means they're valuing different things. Sometimes those things overlap and sometimes they don't, and that's when everybody gets mad on the internet, as will surprise no one. Um, so yeah, it's messy, but I think very strongly it's important because what we can define, even if it's not a perfect definition, but if we can define something that roughly works, then we can talk about it to other people who are not in the field, the community, the industry, the amorphous blob of humans, but we can recruit others to this form. And, basically my talk at Big Bad Con is in no small part like basically me saying like this is what happened with the 18th century novel. They didn't all wake up one day and say we were writing novels. Some people were writing great prose romances. Some people were writing tales, some people writing some other bullshit, right? They were not all calling their stuff the same thing. They were not doing it all for the same reason. We call it the novel now because a generation and a half in, the critics came and they said this is what a novel is, and all y'all are in it. And then we had the great forgetting, and all the women got forgotten because they didn't fit into the new definition of what the novel was. And of course, then the novel's definition changes over time. I am trying to get us to avoid the great forgetting and hoping that we can come together to create a working definition that we can all live with, lest people impose it from the outside. Cautionary tales with Dr. Friedman. Indeed, my superpower, as I have been told by more than one person, is the fact that I'm an 18th centuryist. I can come to you with examples from the past of people not unlike us who were trying to make cool shit in difficult scenarios, different kind of difficult scenarios. But history doesn't always repeat, but it does rhyme. And because I see this as a rhyming point is why I am here and not teaching another course on the sexy 18th century. The best of all cool ass centuries for studying the novel, in my not so humble opinion. So, on that note, it has been an hour and 10 minutes. Office hours will resume next Tuesday, and we will talk more about how the students reacted to mechanics, uh, what were the final decisions of those indecisive students? Did a student really adopt Bluebeard's Bride and I Am John? Is that one of the coolest things I've been able to say this semester? Who can say? But more soon. And thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. And I will talk to you live next Tuesday. Yes. Thanks for the office hour and 11 minutes is. Bye.